Welcome back to the open ground. This is the second video in our masculine axis series, and this one is different. It's deeply personal because I am literally inside the work I'm describing. This isn't observation from some detached position. This is internal interrogation happening in real time, with the stakes of my own reconstruction on the line. I am rebuilding myself, and I am building without a map. This isn't metaphor. When I began this reconstruction, I searched for comprehensive philosophical frameworks that could guide Black masculine development from the ground up. What I found was brilliant but fragmented. Baldwin's psychological analysis, Malcolm's transformation example, Du Bois' diagnostic precision, Fanon's revolutionary insight. Pieces of a structure that was never allowed to complete itself. The absence forced a choice: abandon systematic development or build the framework I needed. I choose to build. The personal stakes. My own reconstruction demands more than therapeutic insights or political analysis. I need scaffolding that can hold the specific contradictions I navigate daily, carrying unprocessed family trauma while building something new, functioning in professional environments that alternately demand and fear my presence, maintaining individual development while carrying collective weight I never chose but can't abandon. The inherited models had all collapsed under real pressure. The performative masculinity that hides fragility behind aggression. The reactive masculinity that defines itself against white expectations. The therapeutic masculinity that pathologizes strength as toxicity. None provided tools for building forward from the specific tensions my existence generates. I need philosophy that emerges from my actual conditions rather than promising to transcend them. Why this framework? The Perpetualist approach became necessary because it's the only philosophical architecture I've encountered that treats tension as foundational rather than problematic. It doesn't promise resolution of contradictions that can't be resolved. It provides mechanisms for building within uncertainty rather than waiting for clarity that never comes. Every other framework I explored either assumed conditions I don't have access to or promised outcomes that would require abandoning essential aspects of who I am. This one meets me where I actually exist, in permanent tension between individual development and collective responsibility, between integration and resistance, between building something new and honoring what can't be forgotten. What I'm offering others. What I'm articulating here isn't complete solution, but proof of concept. That serious Black masculine development can be philosophically rigorous without being academically detached, practically applicable without being simplistic, honest about limitations without abandoning systematic thinking. For other men finding themselves in similar reconstruction, needing more than fragments but lacking comprehensive frameworks that account for their specific conditions, this demonstrates that such frameworks can be built. The mechanisms work under pressure. The integration holds under load. The endpoint of reliability proves itself through sustained testing. As always, we begin from there. Opening. The question of reconstruction. As previously stated, I've been thinking about what it means to rebuild yourself as a man when the inherited models have collapsed. Not the theatrical masculinity that performs strength while hiding fragility, nor the reactive masculinity that defines itself against what it opposes. Something more structural, something that can bear actual weight. The question isn't academic. Every man I know is carrying something, wounds that won't heal through denial, responsibilities that demand more than survival instincts, visions of who he could become if he stopped repeating what he inherited. The usual frameworks offer either nostalgic mythology or therapeutic dissolution. Neither builds infrastructure that endures under pressure. What would a masculine development that refused both denial and collapse actually look like? The architecture of masculine time. There's a geometry to how men experience time that most developmental frameworks ignore. It's not linear progression from broken to fixed, nor cyclical return to some imagined wholeness. It's triune. You exist simultaneously as who you inherited, who you are, and who you're becoming. Cut any dimension and the whole collapses. The anterior self, what you carry. The anterior self is everything unchosen about your beginning. Not just trauma, though trauma is there, but the entire inherited apparatus of conditioning, scripts, and sedimented responses that preceded your conscious participation. For Black men specifically, this includes what Baldwin called the weight of history. But it operates universally. The body remembers patterns it never chose to learn. Most men treat their anterior either as destiny, this is just how I am, or as enemy, I have to overcome my past. Both approaches guarantee slavery to what you're trying to escape. The anterior isn't to be transcended but integrated, which means facing it without illusion. What still governs me that I didn't consciously choose? The courage required here isn't heroic, it's diagnostic. Looking at your inherited patterns with the same precision you'd bring to understanding any other complex system. What operates automatically? Where do you react instead of respond? What still controls your decisions from the shadows? The present self. What you actually bear. The present self cuts through all projection and fantasy. It's not what you intend to build or claim to be building. It's what weight you're actually carrying right now, what relationships you're actually sustaining, what responsibilities you're actually meeting rather than avoiding. This dimension humbles quickly. Most men discover they're carrying far less than they imagine and avoiding far more than they admit. The present self is measured by reliability, not aspiration. As Malcolm X insisted, a man who stands for nothing will fall for anything. The present self is the proof of standing, what you refuse to let drop even when no one is watching. The danger is avoidance disguised as vision. Men often retreat into elaborate plans for who they'll become while their present collapses under neglect. In Perpetualist terms, this is the refusal to engage suchness, the actual texture of reality as it presses against you right now. To measure the present self honestly, what am I actually carrying, and what am I evading? The emergent self. What demands construction? The emergent self isn't fantasy, but structural pressure. The man who could exist if anterior honesty and present bearing aligned. It's not who you want to be, but who is already trying to emerge through you. W.E.B. Du Bois called this the ideal of manhood. Wrestling itself into existence under the weight of double consciousness. The emergent self is that fracture held as possibility. Emergence is teleological, the future insisting on incarnation. It can't be manufactured through will or visualization. It emerges through the disciplined integration of interior honesty and present reliability. To ignore emergent pressure is to calcify in old wounds or drown in present exhaustion. To romanticize it is to live in abstraction while building nothing. The question the emergent self poses isn't who do I want to be, but what is trying to be built through me? This pressure is impersonal. It doesn't care about your preferences or comfort. It only cares whether you're willing to become the infrastructure it requires. Integration, holding the tension. The triune structure only functions through continuous tension. Anterior, present, and emergent must be held simultaneously without collapsing one into another. This isn't balance in the therapeutic sense, finding some comfortable middle ground. It's dynamic tension that generates capacity to bear weight without breaking. Most men fragment. They become archaeologists of their wounds, prisoners of their present limitations, or fantasists of their potential. Integration refuses the luxury of choosing one dimension. It demands that you carry all three while building something that didn't exist before. The scale problem, meta and immediate. Here's where most masculine development collapses: the inability to hold both structural principles and immediate demands without sacrificing one to the other. Men either retreat into abstract ideals that never meet reality, or drown in reactive survival that has no horizon beyond the next crisis. The meta dimension, unconditional orientation. The meta level of masculine function is unconditional. It doesn't ask whether conditions are favorable or recognition is granted. It declares that to be masculine in any meaningful sense is to orient toward weight-bearing, infrastructure building, responsibility carrying. This is structural demand, not personal preference. The danger of meta-orientation is abstraction. Men who declare themselves providers while providing nothing, protectors while protecting no one, leaders while building no followership. Meta without immediate engagement becomes rhetoric floating free of reality. But without meta-orientation, men become purely reactive, blown around by whatever crisis demands attention, with no axis of principle to provide stability. The meta disciplines the immediate by reminding you that your function isn't reduced to your circumstances. The immediate dimension, reality's resistance. The immediate is unforgiving. It's the finite distribution of energy across actual demands. The daily decisions about boundaries, time, presence, money, where theory meets friction and reveals whether you're building something real or maintaining elaborate illusions. The immediate doesn't wait for ideal conditions. It demands response now, with whatever capacity you actually possess, rather than what you wish you possessed. This is where masculine function gets tested, not in abstract principles, but in specific decisions under specific pressures. Without meta-orientation, immediacy consumes everything. Every crisis becomes existential, every urgency becomes master. But without immediate engagement, meta-clarity becomes useless philosophy. The two must discipline each other. Integration, the living axis. To integrate meta and immediate is to refuse collapse in either direction. You maintain structural clarity about your function while engaging the pressing demands of reality. At each decision point, what does this situation structurally require? Not merely what do I want or what feels comfortable. This integration reveals itself most clearly under pressure. Frederick Douglass, holding universal principles of liberty while engaging specific tactics of survival and resistance. Frantz Fanon, maintaining meta-claims about human dignity while navigating immediate degradation and violence. The meta without the immediate would be empty proclamation. The immediate without the meta would be reaction without direction. The masculine axis proves itself in this integration, when you can bear both scales simultaneously without losing coherence. The mechanisms, how the axis holds. If masculine development is to endure rather than collapse under pressure, it requires mechanisms. Not moral ornaments or cultural ideals, but structural necessities that prevent the axis from buckling. Three mechanisms emerge as essential: crucial equilibrium, spectrumal thought, and relational constants. Crucial equilibrium, the hinge of decision. Crucial equilibrium is the disciplined pause between stimulus and response, the space where reaction is suspended long enough to allow structural assessment. What does this situation require of me, rather than what do I want from it? In that pause, masculinity is either forged or forfeited. This isn't balance in the static sense, finding some comfortable middle ground between extremes. It's a living axis, constant recalibration between conviction and adaptability. Conviction without flexibility becomes rigid and shatters. Flexibility without conviction becomes shapeless and dissolves. Historically, this equilibrium appears in the discipline of nonviolent confrontation during the civil rights movement. To absorb blows without retaliation wasn't weakness, but precisely this mechanism at work. The refusal to collapse into immediate reaction. The ability to hold tension until response aligned with structural necessity. The equilibrium prevents collapse into either tyranny of impulse or paralysis of overanalysis. It creates space for response that serves structural demand rather than psychological comfort. Spectrumal thought, calibration against extremes. Masculine qualities exist on gradients, not as binary switches. Courage shades into recklessness, confidence into arrogance, strength into rigidity. To think in binaries is to oscillate violently between extremes, one day inflated, the next deflated. Spectrumal thought prevents this collapse by demanding calibration, self-location along gradients, and deliberate movement toward structural integrity. The man who cannot think spectrumally is condemned to caricature, either strong until he shatters, or gentle until he evaporates. This isn't abstract philosophy, but survival necessity. Consider the enslaved man plotting escape. Too much caution meant paralysis. Too much boldness meant death. Survival required spectrumal calibration, knowing precisely where on the continuum of risk to position himself to bear the weight of family and future. Spectrumal thought reveals that development isn't about toggling between opposites, but refining your position along continua. The axis is preserved not by avoiding extremes, but by calibrating within them with increasing precision. Relational constants, the scaffolding beams. Trust, honesty, restraint, courage, discipline. These aren't moral decorations, but relational constants, structural beams that prevent the axis from buckling under pressure. They endure across contexts, though their expression shifts with circumstance. Their necessity is structural, not aspirational. Without trust, no relationship can bear weight over time. Without honesty, feedback loops detach from reality and collapse into fantasy. Without restraint, immediacy consumes orientation. Without courage, fear dictates collapse. Without discipline, continuity is lost, and infrastructure never emerges. These constants have been the invisible scaffolding of survival itself. Entire communities have depended on men whose word could be trusted, whose restraint kept survival strategies intact, whose discipline sustained structures under assault. They weren't optional virtues, but conditions for collective endurance. The constants are rebuilt in every interaction, renewed or betrayed, moment by moment. Like muscles, they strengthen through resistance. Without them, the masculine axis cannot stand. The process, reconstruction as discipline. Masculine development cannot be reduced to posture, performance, or therapeutic insight. It's fundamentally reconstructive, dismantling inherited distortions, realigning with structural demand, and building concrete infrastructure under real conditions. This reconstruction unfolds in 3 recursive phases. Phase 1, diagnostic honesty. Reconstruction begins with unflinching assessment. The anterior self must be faced as it operates, not as you wish it operated or as others say it should operate. This means exposing where conditioning masquerades as authentic capacity, where performance replaces function, where survival strategies have hardened into prisons. Baldwin warned, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Diagnostic honesty is this facing, the refusal to protect comfortable illusions about your current capacity or function. The gap between what you think you're building and what you're actually building reveals whether you're functioning or fantasizing. Without this honesty, reconstruction cannot begin because you're working from false baseline data. Phase 2, structural alignment. Once the anterior is exposed honestly, reconstruction demands alignment, bringing our inherited patterns, into conscious relation with structural requirements. This is where non-negotiable commitments must be established. Structural alignment means asking, how do I bear weight authentically rather than reactively? To bear reactively is to be governed by stimulus, lashing out at every provocation. To bear authentically is to orient weight toward what is structurally required, regardless of whether conditions are favorable. The enslaved father who taught his children to read under penalty of death was structurally aligned, bearing weight and fidelity to emergent responsibility rather than reacting to external pressure. The activist who registered voters in hostile territory did so not because it was safe, but because it was structurally necessary. Phase 3. Infrastructure development. Reconstruction culminates in infrastructure, what is concretely built through masculine function. This may be intimate, a relationship sustained, communal, institutions established, or cultural, new possibilities created. What matters is that it stands under pressure. Infrastructure isn't built perfectly at once, but refined through feedback, tested under load, adjusted through failure. The question isn't whether the structure is complete, but whether something concrete is emerging through your function. History proves this phase decisive. Black men denied access to existing structures built their own. Schools when education was barred. Churches when institutions excluded them. Businesses when economies shut them out. Each was infrastructure development under hostile conditions. Not symbolic, but survival. Reconstruction as recursive. These phases don't occur once but endlessly. Each failure forces new honesty. Each challenge demands new alignment. Each attempt requires new building. The axis isn't perfected but perpetually reconstructed. This is why masculine development is architecture, not mythology. Myths promise finality. Architecture requires maintenance. The question is never whether you've arrived, but whether you're willing to rebuild again. The integration test. Integration is the decisive test. Everything can be articulated separately. The triune structure, the scale integration, the mechanisms, the phases. But unless they converge in lived practice under pressure, the axis collapses into theory. Integration isn't synthesis in the philosophical sense, nor balance in the therapeutic sense. It's discipline, the continuous refusal of collapse across all dimensions of self, scale, and time. Holding tension without resolution. To integrate is to stand while fractured. You must hold meta-clarity while engaging immediate demand. Bear anterior wounds without being ruled by them. Sustain present burdens while preparing emergent infrastructure. Each dimension threatens to consume the others. Integration doesn't resolve these tensions. It stabilizes them through practice. It makes tension a medium of orientation rather than a threat of annihilation. You become axis by refusing severance, holding the whole without demanding closure. This distinguishes authentic integration from systems that collapse into abstraction or dissolve into relativism. Masculine function persists even under collapse of form. A man may be stripped of recognition, resources, even titles, yet if he bears weight, recalibrates under failure, and builds what must be built, the axis remains intact. Black masculine demonstration. Black history reveals integration not as luxury but as necessity. The man who endured systematic violence yet sustained his family embodied integration. Anterior trauma pressed down. Immediate survival consumed him. Emergent vision demanded construction. Yet he held them together in practice, refusing collapse. Even in political struggle, integration was tested constantly. Movements fractured between abstract ideals and immediate tactics. Leaders collapsed into rhetoric without infrastructure, or action without orientation. Those who endured held both, universal principle and tactical necessity. dignity and survival, resistance and construction. Integration emerges as the most distinctly proven expression of what becomes possible when collapse is refused. For Black men, there was never the possibility of closure, only the discipline of holding contradictions intact until they generated endurance. The axis as living discipline. Integration makes the masculine axis not a state to be achieved, but a practice to be sustained. Daily refusal of collapse, not letting meta-clarity float free of immediate burden, not letting the anterior wounds eclipse emergent responsibility, not letting failure erase orientation. This discipline is recursive. It requires crucial equilibrium to suspend impulse, spectrumal thought to calibrate position, relational constants to maintain scaffolding. Without these mechanisms, integration fragments into illusion. Integration doesn't perfect the man. It proves him as a point others can lean on, not because he's unbroken, but because he won't collapse under tension. Failure and recalibration. The masculine axis isn't defined by invulnerability, but by the capacity to turn failure into structural feedback. Collapse isn't exception, but condition. What distinguishes the axis is not immunity to breakdown, but the discipline of recalibration. Failure as information. Most men treat failure as verdict on their identity. A failed relationship becomes proof of fundamental inadequacy. A lost opportunity corrodes into shame that paralyzes future action. Collapse becomes totalizing rather than informational. Perpetualism insists otherwise. Failure is data, not identity. It exposes misalignment, where anterior wounds were unintegrated, where equilibrium collapsed into impulse, where spectrumal calibration slipped into extremity, where relational constants were betrayed. Baldwin's insight applies here. Failure forces the confrontation you would otherwise evade. It reveals what your actual bearing was, stripped of comfortable illusions. Unwelcome, but honest. Recovery through humility. Recovery requires humility about development's timeline. Masculine culture projects the myth of immediate mastery, that once you decide, you should never falter again. This myth destroys more men than it helps. Development is recursive, not linear. Recovery demands acknowledgement that the axis must be reconstructed repeatedly. That collapse is part of loading, not proof of inadequacy. The Black masculine inheritance has always required such humility. The man released from bondage into sharecropping debt faced collapse into new conditions demanding new recalibration. The activist whose organization fractured under pressure returned to alignment and new strategies. Recovery revealed not weakness but the mechanism of endurance. Recalibration as renewal. Recalibration transforms failure into infrastructure. It's not mere recovery to baseline, but refinement into higher integrity. Where trust was betrayed, recalibration demands new honesty. Where courage faltered into recklessness, recalibration requires spectrumal repositioning. Malcolm X's life demonstrates recalibration as masculine structure. Early collapse into criminality wasn't the end, but feedback. Rigid absolutism eventually collapsed under reality's weight, forcing broader, more sophisticated orientation. Each failure became structural renewal. Recalibration extends crucial equilibrium across time. The pause not just before action, but after collapse, where you ask again, what is structurally required now? Constitutive, not accidental. Integration of failure distinguishes the axis from myth. Masculine myths promise perfection, the flawless provider, invulnerable protector, unerring leader. These myths disintegrate on contact with reality, leaving men shattered when they inevitably fail to embody impossible standards. The axis accepts collapse as constitutive rather than accidental. Failure isn't deviation, but part of the recursive loading required to build capacity. Just as muscle strengthens under repeated stress, masculine reliability strengthens under repeated failures, integrated into recalibration. The Black masculine inheritance stands as profound demonstration of this truth. Survival required turning collapse into information, rebuilding under erasure, recalibrating after destruction. The failure of Reconstruction didn't erase the axis, it demanded new recalibration. The destruction of thriving communities didn't end the impulse to build. It revealed the depth of resistance and need for more resilient infrastructure. The endpoint: reliability, not perfection. The masculine axis doesn't resolve in mythic closure or arrival at final form. Perfection is illusion, a static endpoint that collapses under reality's perpetual demands. The axis resolves in reliability, proven capacity to bear weight, build structure, and recalibrate under failure without surrendering orientation. The rejection of perfection. Masculine perfection is cultural mythology designed to entice and punish. It promises completion, the man who never falters, always provides, never bends. Such a man cannot exist without abandoning humanity. Perfection is brittle. The moment failure arrives, the myth shatters and the man collapses beneath false measures he accepted. The axis rejects this myth categorically. It demands not perfectibility, but endurance. Not that you never fall, but that you never surrender responsibility to rebuild when you do. Reliability is the more exacting demand because it requires perpetual presence rather than mythic arrival. Reliability as structure. Reliability isn't trait, but infrastructure. It's forged through recursive cycles of honesty, alignment, and reconstruction. It emerges not from absence of collapse, but from discipline of recalibration. Reliability is demonstrated when others can lean without fear of collapse. Not because you're unbreakable, but because you've proven you won't remain broken. This surpasses perfection in value. Perfection collapses when tested. Reliability strengthens under load. Historical proof. The Black masculine inheritance proves this endpoint. Perfection was denied from the start. No man could meet mythic measures imposed by systems bent on erasure. Yet reliability emerged as truer measure. Fathers who returned from fields battered but present. Leaders who rebuilt movements after collapse. Communities reconstructed after destruction. Reliability is why survival endures. Despite slavery, segregation, systematic violence, infrastructure continues being built. Families continue being sustained. Culture continues being created. Reliability survives the destruction of illusions. Perpetualist completion. The endpoint of the masculine axis is reliable function. To be countable as one who bears weight, stands in tension, rebuilds when collapsed. The measure isn't grandeur but endurance, not myth but structure. This is why the framework emerges most clearly from Black masculine conditions, where reliability has been most relentlessly tested, most violently demanded, and most faithfully proven. The philosophy doesn't romanticize this fact but recognizes it. The true axis is not perfection, but perpetual refusal of collapse. The living axis. The masculine endpoint is ongoing practice, integration without closure, reconstruction without arrival, reliability without myth. The man, proven reliable, becomes infrastructure for others, not because he solved tension, but because he bears it. The axis remains perpetual. Tension remains unresolved. Reconstruction remains required. Masculinity isn't finished, but reliable. And reliability, not perfection, is the truest proof of the masculine axis. Closing. The continuing work. What I've outlined here isn't prescription, but scaffolding. Architecture for those willing to rebuild rather than repeat. The mechanisms provide structure, not answers. The process provides discipline, not guarantee. The test isn't whether this framework is perfect, but whether it's load-bearing, whether it can hold the weight of actual reconstruction under actual pressure, whether it provides tools that function when comfortable illusions collapse and real building begins. Every man serious about development will find limitations in what I've articulated here. Good. The framework is designed to evolve through engagement, not to provide final answers. What matters is whether it offers sufficient structure to begin again, more honestly, more aligned, more reliable than before. The masculine axis remains unfinished work, not because it's incomplete, but because reliability requires perpetual reconstruction. The discipline continues beyond these words, in whatever infrastructure you're willing to build. I hope this provided something, orientation, or a starting point towards it. Until next time.